geochemical stuff. David Brisky is an ecologist at Texas A&M. You saw his work referenced last night by John Walker. He's also my PhD advisor. Maria Fernandez-Minas is on our group. She's a social ecologist at Colorado State University, really looking at how people make decisions and why. Ken Tate's one of the top rangeland hydrologists in the country. He's out at UC Davis. Leslie Roach is a postdoc out there with him on some projects with us. We have in collaboration. And Emily Katurgis was a postdoc with us there in Cheyenne, and currently now is at the Denver Tech Center for the Bureau of Land Management. So I've been quite fortunate to be a part of this large group, a really nice cadre of folks to work with. Because talk about adapting grazing management today, and I want to set the stage by backing up, looking at rangelands as complex systems. You saw, if you went to the talk last night, John Walker talked about the new issue of rangelands in complex systems. And essentially, we are dealing with some very interacting social, ecological, and economic components of rangelands. Unfortunately, most of the research focuses on the ecological aspects. Very little on the social, although we're now starting to see scientists come on board with that. Maria Fernandez-Minas is one that's on our group. And the economics has largely been omissed. I'm going to showcase some of the stuff by Alan Terrell later in discussion today, but there's very few people who are out there working on rangeland economics. We have all that in rangelands, and then we have the people who do the management. And sometimes we forget that those are the managers who are capable of learning from, right, and adapting to the changing circumstances. So there's experiential knowledge. So folks have been out there for multiple generations. You know, I'm a fifth-generation ranch kid from the Sandals, Nebraska. 1878, that place was established. A lot of knowledge has been gleaned off of that time and now still put in place, but still we learn about that. How can we capture that sort of information and put it into the science and management interface here? I was fortunate to be part of what the NRCS, Natural Resources Conservation Service, led a large effort that came up with a book in 2011. Here are the conservation benefits of rangeland practices. It's available at that long URL website there. Simply just go to Google, type in conservation benefits of grazing. It'll pop it right up for you. All that book is online. There's several chapters about the major rangeland management practices. The one in which I'm going to talk about is grazing. Kim Tate was on that chapter with me, Daniel Milchunas out of Colorado State University, and Dave Brisky. Key findings out of that, we synthesized the literature for the last 60 to 70 years, looked at all those publications. To no one's surprise, stocking rate came out as the key management variable. John talked about it last night, it's been emphasized in other presentations, but we've got to get that right. And we know what that looks like when it's right, and we also know what it looks like when it's wrong. Continuing the saga of the rotational grazing versus continuous grazing, no clear advantage of one grazing system over another. In terms of grazing system, looking at the production angle, both forage, livestock production, species composition, wildlife aspects, soil hydrology. The literature doesn't showcase that. We'll look at the dogma, though, in some continuing slides. And all grazing systems are constrained by stocking rate and weather. So it doesn't really matter what system you may employ, but you have to deal with your stocking rate, getting it right, and then you deal with this intrinsic variability of weather. We're going to showcase some examples with that here in a minute. Key gaps. One of the great things about doing literature synthesis, looking what's out there, is finding out what's not out there. Here's what's not out there. There's a big disconnect out there between management and science knowledge sources. Virginia brought this up this morning in a fantastic presentation. Where the scientists get their information from, where the managers get it from, is it the same thing? Are we coming from the same sources? And that scales of applicability. We're doing research work on small pastures, usually on experimental stations. Ranchers are doing their, quote, research, right, on large ranches, dealing with lots of variability and management. Science has also often overlooked that contribution of the human dimensions, right, the decision-making that's going on inside that human and the adaptive management, because scientists are control freaks. We have to be, because we have to publish in scientific journals read and reviewed by other scientific people like us that are control freaks. You've got to have the scientific method done right. You have to have the right number of controls. You have to have replications. You have to have everything else controlled for other than what you want to, what your treatments are. Can't have anything confounding. So it becomes really a narrow focus. And so you've got a complex system with a lot of management. So we take everything out we can and say, let's focus on this one or two key variables, look at the responses, and generalize those land management recommendations. It just doesn't work all the time. For limitations, the opposite is also true. So we talk with a lot of ranchers, and boy, this management thing that they did looks really great on their place, but we can't replicate on somebody else's. Well, we don't really know for sure if it was a management change or if there's something else, what was confounding there. So those anecdotal findings and the lack of controls, right, on ranches limit the implications we can draw from those in terms of science and from the replication for comparative purposes. So it's a two-way street here. Science has to learn to work with management. Management needs to work with science. I think we can make it work here pretty slick. Key recommendations coming out of this nice book chapter. Number one was adaptive management and conservation programs. NRCS is the principal financial source for a lot of these conservation programs. One of the key recommendations put up, the management should be adaptive. That is, you implement it, you monitor key aspects of it towards your desired outcomes, and if you're not making progress, change the management with that fundamental understanding that the monitoring feedback caused that decision. Not just employ the management practice for the 4 or 5 years, get your payment, and then things are done. You have to actively and adaptively manage those systems. Integrate that experiential, that land manager, integrate that social knowledge. What's going on in the community? What's going on in the public? What do they want to see? As well as the biophysical knowledge. We've got a pretty good understanding of that. Soils, landforms, plant communities. And lastly, again, Virginia brought this up, strengthen that management and conservation and science linkages here. How do we do that? We've got to get the management folks up front as stakeholders before we start the science and continue them through the process. So why adaptive management? Well, I'm going to go through some slides here and talk about each of these bullets. But decision making is pretty darn complex. It's not a simple thing. It's not a yes-no. It's look out there and think, when should I put cattle out? Well, Grandpa always talking about June 15th. June 15th is a decision, right? Doesn't always work that way. When do we take cattle off? What type of cattle? What do we want to do in terms of other management decisions? We're dealing with a system that's highly variable in terms of within season variability and precipitation, across season precipitation and spatial variability, and therefore forage production is going to be quite variable. I'll showcase some slides on that. We're dealing with a landscape that has variable topography, highlands, lowlands, slopes. We've got different soils out there, ecological sites, and the vegetation communities. It's not a simple game to play here in terms of matching up pastures and where animals should be moved. And we're dealing with an increased climate variability, more extreme events occurring. Seasons may be getting longer in terms of growing seasons. We're seeing more variability in terms of that shift in precipitation. How do we handle that? We can't have static management if we have variability out on the landscape. That said, here's something, a nice exercise. We threw together 11 producers, conservation folks, environmental groups, ranchers, and some land managers and public agencies in a stakeholder group and said, we're going to give you a chunk of our research experiment station. We want you to manage it. Yours, lock, stock, and barrel. Just tell us how you're going to do it. First priority was, you have to come up with what the desired outcomes are for your pastures that we've given you. And we gave them about 3,000 acres, 10 different pastures. This is the first chicken scratch that they came up with. So they have, how many up there? Probably about 8 or 10 objectives, vegetation as well as some wildlife, as well as some overarching objectives for ranching, enterprise economics, all kinds of management practices that would get them, hopefully, to achieve those objectives. And we said, great. Now, how do we do it on the ground in an experimental fashion such that we can produce a scientific publication and inform other land managers that this is a great thing? Needless to say, we're still working on implementing this process. The key point is, this is not a simple thing. It's not what we just said before, is just put animals out there. It's a complex system. So we've got complex decision making. Here's some precipitation values from our Central Plains Experimental Range. This is an area just south of Cheyenne in north central Colorado. Research station for us since 1939. Annual precipitation denoted here. In terms of inches, there is the mean. If John's in here, mean is not the median, right? So we know that the median value is going to be down here at about 12, a little bit below 12 down in here. So that's the long-term average. we see that, I think, actually, John, there was one year that it was on the average mark here. But look how variable it is, all the way from below 5 inches to above 22.5 in a system that gets about 13 inches of rain. How do we manage a system that's this variable over time? Okay. That's across years. Within years, let's look at how variable the same exact property is. The bars indicate the average precipitation across those 70-plus years. So most of the rain in May, June, July. The error bars here are the standard deviations, so this is what the normal range of variation is. Okay, so we can manage for that. Problem is, we've got this blue line. This is the maximum ever recorded. Here's the minimum ever recorded for those months. So now we've got a situation where we could plan for an average year and get stuck here like this or this, and we have to be adaptive with our management to take advantage of those situations. If we get a situation like this, how can we take advantage and make hay while the sun shines, if you will? And if we get something like this, how do we minimize or mitigate our problems with drought and low forage production? So that's variability of precipitation across years, variability of precipitation within years, and then we deal with space. So this is that same research station down in northern Colorado, about 5 by 6 miles square, about 16,000 acres, outlining some pastures. This is the 2013 recent precipitation from May through early September, right before the big rains hit. The darker the color is, the more precipitation we got. So this is about, as the crow flies, 8 miles. Within that, we go from 6.5 inches of rain for the summer to below 3. Again, how do we deal with that sort of thing? Imagine if you got a place that's got a couple 100,000 acres. You're dealing with a Forest Service grassland that might expand across hundreds of miles, 4 or 5 different counties. You just can't say management here is going to be applicable across here, and you can't just make blanket management recommendations. You've got to be able to deal with that sort of variability and precipitation. We go, same research station. We've got precipitation being variable. We've got a whole suite of ecological sites. Everybody who drives past just thinks, oh my God, that shortgrass prairie is just boring. It's the same stuff. Boy, the ecological sites people, the soils people who made the map sure as heck thinks it's a lot different than it is. There's about 10 different ecological sites on 16,000 acres. And of course, they don't align themselves into nice half sections or something for experimental design. That would be nice from a scientific method standpoint. So for us trying to come up with pairs of pastures becomes quite problematic. Nonetheless, though, we can take advantage of this variability, right, in terms of managing adaptatively how we look at that system across time and space and with different plant communities. Some of our upland plant communities are more dominated by the short grasses. We've got some lowland and more lower areas that have some salt bushing, and they could take advantage of that and some cool season grasses. We have elevation out there as well. Not so much as you'd see in parts of Wyoming, of course, but we have some areas here that are high in terms of elevation that are blue, low in terms of red, and then the yellows are kind of in between. So on that 16,000 acre property, we have all kinds of variability in precipitation across years, within years, spatially. We've got different soils, ecological sites, and topography. Now, you tell me how to manage a simple place, a 16,000 acre property. Now, extrapolate that out to states, up to large regions, up to the entire U.S., up to the global range, and it becomes quite complex. Here's just some pictures to reinforce some of the variability we've seen at that site. 2002 was the first year I came. Guess what? The drought started. Coincidence or not? 2003 it wasn't too bad. 2004 about the same, same pasture here, just different looks. 2005 a whole lot different. 2006, where's Rachel with her nice smartphone doing rangeline monitoring? This is pretty simple. Brown, brown, brown. Sample frequency would have been simple. Nothing, nothing, nothing. We got a rainfall event just before July 4th, and then green right back up. So a very system that can respond to it, but again, how do we manage systems that are so darn variable like this? We just can't use static management. Okay, you heard, if you went to John's talk last night, Alan Savory came into the country in the late 70s, early 80s. You could double your stocking rate, double your production, Boy, what an economic return. Well, I think Alan may have missed the boat here, but Alan Terrell, the other Alan from New Mexico State, I think has got it right in terms of economics here. And I'll take some time to let's walk through this. Nice paper he just published in 2010 in Rangeland Ecology Management. One of the very few on economics and rangelands. It's got stocking rate down in New Mexico. So he's got two different systems. He's got a conservative rate. This is essentially a light to low moderate, if you will. And then he's got what he calls a flexible stocking rate, where you try to adjust animal numbers to the precipitation and forage. So it's a pretty adaptive system. Within each of those stocking rates, he runs either cow-calf only or cow-calf with a yearling steer component. So this is run for a typical New Mexico ranch over a time period of about 30 years for economics. So let's go down the conservative route. Cow-calf producer, 100% of your forage goes there. You never buy yearlings. Over about 30-year period, on average, about $55,000 net return to that ranch. Pretty good living. Right? You could probably make it work on that. If you just keep that same stocking rate, but you add the flexibility of yearlings coming in when you have extra forage, the estimates from the model are about 55% of the time you would buy those, you'd make a little bit more money here, about $8,000 or 14% increase just by being flexible enough to accommodate that extra enterprise into your system, yearlings. Okay. Now, let's say you go flexible and you try to again match the forage with stocking rate with your forage, but you only go cow-calf because you're going to go simple. Again, no yearlings, $69,000. So $14,000 just because you're able to match stocking with forage compared to just being conservative. Here's where the game wins, though. Flexible stocking. So again, trying to match forage with the animals out there. Multiple, so you're going to add stockers in when you can. So when times are good, you're going to graze it and take advantage of that. When times are bad, you don't have to bring those yearlings in, and you don't have to sell the cows. Okay? So he's going to run about 25% of the forage. So 3/4, 1/4 is how the operation would be set up. You buy yearlings about half the time. Boy, annual net returns, look at this baby, $115,000. Now, just compared over the multiple to the cow-calf only, $45,000. Compare this one, which is I would call high management versus low management. There's your double in economic returns. Without doing anything much different other than just being more conscientious of what's going on with the management, being more in tune with what's going on the land, and having the flexibility in your management to make those changes in your enterprise. So truly, I think a way to increase economic returns from rangelands here that Alan has really done a nice job with. We look at that sort of enterprise and we're dealing with this forecasted climatic changes here put out by IPCC, International Panel on Climate Change, and many others. One of the things you're probably looking at is what's the outcomes that we want from those rangelands. And John talked about this last night. Is it production? Is it conservation? Is it both? What is it that we want from those rangelands? Our decision making then has to incorporate some sort of monitoring feedback, such as Rachel's smartphone or something else, because we're going to be dealing with droughts and deluges and droughts, all right? Back and forth and back and forth. And we've seen that just this year alone. Came out of the drought of 2012 in a bad shape, started 2013 in bad shape, got a little bit of rain in July in parts of the Wyoming, and then September, if you're in southern Wyoming or parts of Colorado, you got the deluge, right? Boy, those 14 inches of rain sure as heck did a lot of good to produce forage. Now, on the annual precipitation, it's going to look like it was a heck of a year, right? But for areas that were able to not have a lot of runoff, that soil water is in pretty good shape for next year. How do we take advantage of this sort of thing for management science partnerships? How do we bring folks like this room together to help inform science from the management side and vice versa, help the managers with the science needs? Talk about a project here, and there's a slide I'll talk about a little bit later, a new project we just got started. How do we move those livestock spatially and temporally on the landscape, on the ranch, across ranches, maybe across states, within and across years? So how do we have that flexibility in the system to move the animals to where the forage needs to be when we need them to have them there? And how do we incorporate human dimensions? This aspect, again, that John brought up last night. We can do great management, but it's the human side that really is where the rubber hits the road. How do we get that sort of thing to the land managers and the experiential knowledge back in touch with science? So here's an experiment that whole group on the front there is helping me partake of. This is down at that Colorado research station again, so here's kind of the general outline of the whole station, roughly 16,000 acres. Before we ever started the experiment in Virginia, the whole goal was bring in the managers we want to run this place. So we have NGOs, we have environmental groups, we have conservation groups, we have public land managers, we have ranchers, 11 of them in total. Sat them in a room, and we gave them 10 pastures, again, about 3,000 acres of this 16,000 acre place. And we said, the yellow ones are the traditional management. We know from prior research that moderate stocking for season long does a pretty good job down here. Your whole goal is to beat it. And we don't care how you do it, but it's up to you to do it. Collectively, they have to come up with what are the goals, what are the outcomes. They have to agree as a group to do that. Talk about a nice level discussion when you've got groups in there that are polar opposites. But they did a nice job. They've got a livestock goal, they've got a wildlife goal, and they've got an economic goal. Now, do those all mesh well together? Not at all. There's some things that are clearly going to be fun to look around. One of the things that they did come up with, though, is they know the system. And we've got great research data. We've got a lot of information we can provide them in terms of soils, in terms of topography, prior management. Histories are all very similar. We matched up these pastures as well as we could. We've got all the prior data in terms of precipitation. We've got aerial photography. We've got composition, etc. Their whole goal is to come up with a way to move cattle on the landscape. Now, what they've come up with is a 10-pasture rotational system, if you will. They clearly don't want to graze the same pasture at the same time in consecutive years. They've also banked into the system a little idea called grass banking, where they're going to take hopefully a couple pastures and keep them rested each year. So the plan is to only graze 8 of the 10 pastures, leave 2 ungrazed as their reserve in case they have bad years, and if they don't, guess what? They still produce a high amount of forage, structure for grassland birds. They might incorporate some prescribed burning for cactus control if they need to. They also have the flexibility to use those pastures if they need to get them through a grazing season. Now, how are they going to move the animals around on the landscape? Boy, they're really struggling with that one. What are the triggers? Because it has to be science-based for those of us on the science side to be able to write the papers. Why did those animals move and when? Well, because John out there thought they needed to move. That's not good enough for us. We need to have a criteria. So they're working on some sort of thing from visual obstruction or some sort of degree of use that's consistent across those pastures. We're going to do the monitoring. We're going to do annual monitoring, so the long trajectory things. We're going to do really short-term stuff, so we give them immediate feedback on essentially a real-time basis on a weekly if they need to know what's going on out there. All kinds of photo points and everything else make this interactive and web-based as possible. Clearly a unique and novel endeavor. I hope John likes it. I'm hopeful that he's one of the few grazing guys left in the profession. So he said last night there's only 2 things still worth looking at. This wasn't one of them. So I'm hoping his list just expanded one more, or maybe this is somewhere within those 2. But it's a lot of encouragement for us, and we're going to have a lot of fun with it. For us, I think just in summary, you got to be flexible in your management. Those that are very static, that do the same thing every year, we know it's predictability that is. Those of us who went through college several times, different degrees, know that that's a good definition for a word that somebody ought to be looking at. And we're dealing with variability in terms of droughts and deluges. Not just a little bit, but we're seeing some really marked changes in some of this precipitation variability. And the whole goal, if we can be adaptive here, is, boy, when things are good, let's enhance them. Let's take advantage of that. And when things are bad, let's mitigate that as much as possible. If we can do that, here's some strategies. We can grass bank for drought management. That's been well recognized, done many times. And Alan's great work shows that that's an economic improvement to the whole operation. So I'm pretty sure that's going to get the eyes and ears of most of the land managers when they can see an economic improvement. With that, hopefully you can see that slide. That was one of Herb Minry's slides. One of the high schoolers just talked about intensive rotational grazing. I think that's going to be a pretty quick rotation system there. Herb actually grew up on the same exact family ranch I did there in Sand Hills, Nebraska. He definitely got a talent to draw. If that had been me, you couldn't have seen anything with the stick figures of me. So I appreciate Herb's talent, and I'll take advantage of it when I can. Brian, with that, take some questions if there's time. Any questions? The question is that we're going to the stakeholder group. Is there a financial side to that? Yes, there is a financial side per se, Joe. We're going to keep track of all the time, effort, hours, resources expended, fence, water, and so forth to try to come up with what is the cost of doing management like that. Because one of the questions from the producers that are in that group is, if that is better for me in terms of other things, wildlife habitat, vegetation structure, how much does it cost me? Or do I still make the same amount of money from my livestock side? So yeah, there's an economic side. We've got an economics professor from CSU going to be working with us on that. Yeah, so to follow up, Joe, there is no banker on that, but that's a great suggestion. We ought to look at expanding, at least bringing a person like that in as ex officio at least. The 4 ranchers on that group are all very sharp ranchers. Their pencils have been sharpened many times. They understand the economics probably better than anybody. So they're clearly cognizant of that. We did tell them, though, that their goal is to run those cattle year grazing season long, right? We don't want them being reactive seat of the pants management when it gets dry. They're hopefully building in some resilience in the system, right, with that grass banking and perhaps improvement in forage over time, that they should be able to extend that grazing season. If we get a worst case scenario and they have to pull the animals from their treatment, we'll do the same from the conservative stocking treatment to maintain the parallel with the scientific treatments. But that's a great suggestion. I'll take that back to the group. Other questions? Anything from online, Brian? They're all bored. It's after lunch. They're sleeping. John, there are no sheep herders in that group, unfortunately. Now, we are working with a great group of folks sitting right up here in Thunder Basin with a brand new scientist that actually have sheep. So we can do multi-species grazing if you would like up there. Sheep don't sell well in Weld County, Colorado. Now, although it's the #1 county in the nation for the number of sheep, because sheep on feed at the feedlot situation. And most of them are killed in that county. Great question. So were the pasture configurations using what was existing, or did we set them up? We used as many as we could that were existing, but we modified anything and everything we could to make sure the pasture pairs between what the stakeholders were working with and what we were working with traditional grazing are as similar as possible. So we did modify several of those fences to do that. And some of that might have been just changing the angle of the fence, replacing an entire portion of a fence. But we went ahead and made that infrastructure commitment prior to the start of the project because we didn't want to get into it and have that as a potential confounding down the road. And we've just done 2013 as a background baseline year, so now we have all the data to start with before the experiment starts next spring. So we actually can use that data that helps, if there's any differences to start with, co-vary that out as the project starts. So that's also something that most grazing projects never have, is that first baseline year data. I think there's a question up front. Any question was about any risk management or hedging aspect, financials on the livestock here? We are not using any of that at this time. So the cattle come in first part of May, they leave essentially first part of October. Interestingly, 2 of the ranchers on the stakeholder group actually are providers of some of the cattle. So inherently, they do have a little bit at risk, of course, here with this. But yeah, we tried to keep that at bay. We'll see how it works. This is a work in progress. It may blow up in our face, and there may be some things that we'll do down the road much differently. But as of now, we don't have that built in the system. We've got enough complexity already. I think we're already a little overwhelmed at how much we've got to do. Great question, Joe. I forgot. It's going to be a moderate recommended NRCS stocking rate down there. Down in that system, it's 10 yearling steers on 160 acres, season-long, 5 months during the summer. So typically on those 320-acre pastures, we'd have 20 yearling steers, 650 pounds coming in. They'll go off at about 950, 300 pounds a gain. Interestingly, the group collectively decided they're going to run one herd of 200 head, and they're going to rotate it. So it'll be exciting for us to see what sort of increasing grazing pressure, increasing number of animals on a pasture does. None of my technicians down there have ever seen that sort of number of animals in a pasture. I think they may get big-eyed and really wild here the first couple times we move some cattle around. All right, thank you much. I'll be around the rest of the day and tomorrow.
Thank you, Justin.